He's the tough guy who survived prison, addiction, and Hollywood. But nothing prepared fans for this. At 81, Danny Trejo's story has taken a turn no one saw coming. Known for his grit and fight, what's happening now is more painful than any role he's played. It's raw, it's real, and it's leaving a trail of broken hearts across the internet. You've seen him conquer demons, but this is different. This is the part of his life no one wanted to believe was true. Danny Trejo's story didn't begin in Hollywood. It started on the tough streets of Los Angeles, where survival was a daily challenge. He grew up surrounded by violence, addiction, and chaos. His uncles were in and out of jail, and by the time he was a teenager, Danny himself was deep into drugs and crime. By the age of 12, he had already tried heroin. By 18, he was in and out of juvenile halls and eventually adult prisons. For most people, that would have been the end of the road, but for Danny, it was only the beginning. Prison was brutal, but it was also the place where something shifted. He found boxing behind bars and became a champion in multiple facilities. More importantly, he found sobriety and a second chance. After years of running from himself, he decided to turn things around. When he got out of prison, he joined a 12-step recovery program. Helping others stay clean became a central part of his life. He didn't have a plan to become an actor. That wasn't even on his radar. He just wanted to stay clean and help others do the same. His path into acting happened by accident. In the early 1980s, he visited a movie set to support a friend staying sober. Someone noticed his intense look and asked if he could play a tough guy in the background. One day turned into many, and soon he was being cast as the bad guy in countless movies. His face, rugged, scarred, unforgettable, became his calling card. But what made Danny stand out wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he carried himself. Every scene, no matter how small, felt real because it came from a man who had lived through the worst and survived. He wasn't trying to be a movie star. He was trying to live with purpose. But slowly, Hollywood started to see what others had missed. Behind the tattoos and tough stare was a man with heart, depth, and a story worth telling. Danny's early roles may have been typecast, but his presence was undeniable. Over time, he became more than a background character. He became a legend, not just for where he ended up, but for everything he overcame to get there. Fame didn't hit Danny Trejo like a lightning bolt. It crept in little by little, with every role where he played the tough guy, the gangster, the man you don't want to cross. At first, he was just grateful to be working. He'd show up on set, do his job, and go home. No trailer, no fancy dressing room, no Hollywood attitude, just work. That's how Danny survived, by keeping things simple and real. But as the roles piled up and his face became more recognizable, fame started to change the way the world saw him. Suddenly, he wasn't just that guy from the movie. He was Danny Trejo. People started stopping him on the street, asking for photos, shaking his hand. He smiled, posed, thanked them, always kind, always humble. But inside, it felt strange. This attention, this praise, this public love, it didn't match the way he saw himself. He still felt like the ex-con trying to stay clean, the guy who used to steal cars and sleep with one eye open. Fame didn't erase his past. It just put a spotlight on a man who never expected to be seen. The roles kept coming, and with them came pressure. People expected him to be the same character on and off the screen. They wanted the scarred face, the mean stare, the gruff voice. But Danny wasn't just that guy. He had layers, pain, and stories that didn't fit into a script. He often joked about always playing the villain, but deep down, he wondered if anyone would ever see past the typecast. Was he only valuable when he looked dangerous? Even as his face became iconic, the reality behind the scenes wasn't always glamorous. The movie business is tough, and Danny knew he couldn't afford to slow down. He said yes to everything: big-budget films, B-movies, voiceovers, TV cameos. Not because he was chasing fame, but because he never wanted to go back to where he came from. Every job was insurance. Every paycheck meant security. Every role was a reminder that he was still surviving. But survival came with a price. The long days on set, the travel, the press, they took a toll. There were days he'd wake up in a hotel room and forget what city he was in. Nights when the applause and flashing cameras faded, and he was left alone with the quiet. And that quiet was dangerous. Because in the silence, the past had a way of creeping back in. The old guilt, the regrets, The faces of people he'd hurt before he found recovery. He stayed clean. That was non-negotiable. But staying mentally and emotionally okay, that was harder. Fame didn't protect him from depression, from exhaustion, from the moments where he questioned whether all of this, the movies, the awards, the money, actually made him happy. He was working non-stop, but was he really living? And then came the expectations. People looked at him as a symbol of redemption, of survival, of beating the odds. That kind of pressure is heavy. Danny didn't want to let anyone down. Not the fans, not the recovery community, not the kids who saw him as a role model. So he kept smiling, kept showing up, even when he was tired, even when he felt empty. He gave everything he had, sometimes too much. Behind the scenes, there were family struggles too. Fame didn't make him immune to heartbreak. Relationships were complicated. His time was stretched thin. And no matter how many people loved his characters, it didn't fill the gap left by time, lost with loved ones. He tried to stay present, to be a better father, a better friend. But when you're constantly working, constantly performing, there's always a part of your real life that takes the hit. Still, he kept going. He opened restaurants, shared his story in schools and prisons, showed up for recovery meetings even after a long day on set. He knew his purpose was bigger than movies. He didn't just want to be remembered as the guy who played Machete. He wanted to be remembered as the guy who gave others hope, the guy who proved that you could come from nothing, do terrible things, and still change, still be loved, still make something of your life. But the older he got, the more he felt the weight of all those years, the grind, the effort it took just to stay steady. He didn't complain. That wasn't his style, but his eyes told the story. Eyes that had seen too much, survived too much, and still got up every morning with the same determination, not to be famous, just to keep going. Danny Trejo never asked to be a star. He just didn't want to die in a cell. Everything else, the movies, the fame, the fans, was extra. A miracle maybe, but even miracles come with shadows. And for Danny, survival meant facing those shadows every day, even when the lights were brightest. He lived like he acted, all in, no half measures. That's what made him unforgettable on screen. But it's also what made the price of fame so steep. Because being real in a world that rewards performance, that's the hardest role of all. In the later chapters of Danny Trejo's life, things looked bright from the outside. He was still working, still being recognized in public, still that gritty face people instantly associated with tough, no-nonsense characters. But behind the scenes, real life didn't follow a movie script. The challenges Danny had fought so hard to leave behind started creeping back in, not in the form of old habits, but in new, unexpected ways that hit just as hard. It started with money. People assumed that someone who'd been in dozens of movies must be set for life. But Hollywood doesn't always work that way. Danny said yes to a lot of roles over the years, and while some paid well, many didn't. He didn't care much at the time. He loved the work, he loved the people, and he loved staying busy. But as years went on and responsibilities piled up, he realized how fast money could vanish. Between agents, managers, lawyers, taxes, and trying to help out people in his circle, the cash didn't stretch as far as it looked. Then came the IRS. Out of nowhere, Trejo found himself facing a multi-million-dollar tax bill. It wasn't because he was living like a king or being reckless. It was paperwork, mistakes, and blind spots that added up over time. When the news broke, people were shocked. How could someone who seemed so solid, so put together, be in debt like that? But Danny didn't hide. He faced it like everything else in his life, head on. He admitted it. He owned it. And he made a plan to pay it back, dollar by dollar. That honesty made people respect him even more, but it didn't make the road any easier. Suddenly, every project mattered more. Every appearance, every deal. He couldn't afford to slow down, even though his body, now in its 70s, was begging for rest. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about digging out from a hole, trying to rebuild stability in the years most people are slowing down. And then, as if the financial pressure wasn't enough, scandal started circling. Some came from people he trusted, business partners, friends, folks who saw Danny's name and thought they could use it for their gain. Others came from the internet, rumors, half-truths, stories twisted for clicks. Danny had spent decades earning trust, showing up for communities, staying clean, staying real. But none of that stopped the whispers. He tried not to let it get to him. But even the toughest hearts have soft spots, and Danny's had always been his reputation. He didn't want to be seen as some rich actor or fallen celebrity. He wanted to be known as the guy who turned his life around and stayed true to that journey. So when stories started floating around about bad investments or shady deals, it hurt. Not just because of what people were saying, but because he had worked so hard to be better, to never go back to the man he used to be. His restaurant businesses also faced ups and downs. What started as a dream to bring good food and good energy into communities became a balancing act. Some locations struggled. The pandemic didn't help. People he'd hired, sometimes out of loyalty or to give second chances, didn't always deliver. But Danny didn't point fingers. He kept showing up, kept trying to make it work, because giving up wasn't something he knew how to do. Physically, the years were catching up too. The kind of life Danny lived, hard, fast, full of stress, doesn't leave you untouched. He began to feel it more deeply. The aches lasted longer. The energy didn't come as easily. Doctors warned him to slow down, to rest, to take better care of himself. But how do you rest when your whole life has been about momentum? Danny wasn't used to sitting still. Stillness made room for memories, and not all of them were kind. Sometimes the old pain would sneak in late at night. He'd think about the people he'd lost, friends who never made it out, family who had passed, regrets that never fully healed. He never pretended to be fearless. He just knew how to keep moving forward in spite of the fear. But during those quiet nights, when the world had gone to sleep and the spotlight had turned off, the battles returned. Not with drugs or violence anymore, but with questions like, have I done enough? Have I made peace with my past? And yet, even with all that pressure, Danny kept showing up. He still visited schools, prisons, recovery groups. He still shook hands and gave hugs and listened to people's stories like they mattered, because they did. He never thought of himself as above anyone. In fact, he often said he was just lucky to be alive. That humility stayed with him, even when the headlines didn't. What made it all harder was how few people really understood what he was going through. Most saw the photos, the movies, the restaurants, the inspirational quotes. They didn't see the man sitting at his kitchen table, trying to make sense of balance sheets and paperwork. They didn't see the tired eyes behind the sunglasses or the weight he carried on his shoulders every day. He didn't complain. That wasn't his style. But people close to him started to notice the toll it was taking. He was quieter, more reflective, less interested in the fame, more focused on legacy. Not the Hollywood kind, but the kind that lasts. The kind where a kid in a tough neighborhood hears Danny's story and decides to take a different path. That's what mattered to him. Danny Trejo never claimed to be perfect. He never tried to be a saint. What made him stand out wasn't the tattoos or the voice or the roles. It was the fight. The raw, relentless fight to stay real in a world that often isn't. And in this later stage of life, with debt, scandal, and exhaustion knocking on his door, that fight didn't stop. It just changed shape. Now, it wasn't about running from cops or escaping addiction. It was about holding on to peace, protecting his name, and showing the world that survival doesn't end when the spotlight hits you. It keeps going, through the hard years, through the headlines, through the moments no one sees. Danny's life had always been a battle, but now, more than ever, it was clear. He wasn't fighting for fame or recognition anymore. He was fighting for peace, for clarity, for one final chapter where he could breathe, rest, and be remembered not just for who he was on screen, but for the man he became when the cameras stopped rolling. In the final stretch of his life's long and winding road, Danny Trejo wasn't chasing fame anymore. He wasn't trying to prove himself to Hollywood or to the world. He had already done that 100 times over. What mattered now wasn't the roles or the red carpets. It was something deeper, something quieter. Redemption, humility, purpose. By now, Danny had seen more than most people could even imagine. He had walked through prison gates, slept in cold cells, battled addiction, stood on film sets, opened restaurants, and spoken to thousands. But the biggest transformation wasn't on the outside. It was inside. The angry, broken kid who once punched his way through life had slowly grown into a man who led with kindness, patience, and wisdom. And that wasn't an act. Danny had no interest in pretending to be anything he wasn't. What you saw with him was what you got. If he was hurting, he'd say it. If he was proud of someone, he'd show it. He didn't speak like a preacher or a polished motivational speaker. He just spoke the truth, straight from the heart. And somehow, that hit harder than anything scripted ever could. He still worked when he could. Guest spots, voiceovers, quick scenes in indie films. But he also turned down more and more offers. Not because he didn't need the money. The IRS debt still loomed, but because his time had become precious. He'd rather spend the day talking to a group of high school kids about staying clean than shooting another gangster role just for a paycheck. Fame, he learned, fades. But impact, real impact, sticks around. You'd find him at local recovery meetings, sitting in the back like anyone else. No celebrity treatment, no big entrances, just Danny, the guy who'd been clean for decades and still treated every meeting like it was his first. He'd hug newcomers, listen without judgment, offer his phone number, and follow up, not because he had to, because he wanted to. That was the code he lived by. You can't keep what you don't give away. The people closest to him saw the shift. He smiled more. He didn't carry the same weight of needing to be on all the time. He talked more about his grandkids, his dogs, his garden. Yes, Danny Trejo had a garden. In a quiet corner of his modest LA home, he grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. A small patch of peace in a life once filled with chaos. He said there was something healing about watching things grow, slowly, with care. Maybe because his own healing had been the same. But even with all the peace he had found, he never erased his past. He talked about it openly. The fights, the drugs, the terrible mistakes. He didn't glamorize it, and he didn't hide it. It was part of him, but it didn't define him. That was the line he drew. "I'm not my worst moment," he once said, "and neither are you." The world tried to put him in boxes. Addict, felon, gangster, celebrity, tough guy. He had worn them all, but none of those labels stuck as much as the one he gave himself. Servant. Danny lived to serve others. Whether it was a stranger in need, a dog at his rescue shelter, or a fan who just wanted 5 minutes of his time, he showed up, fully, with heart, with humility. He knew what it was like to have nothing, so when he had something, even a little, he shared it. If someone needed help with groceries, he helped. If someone needed a job, he found them one. His restaurants became second chances for people who couldn't get hired anywhere else. Ex-cons, recovering addicts, single parents. Danny opened doors for them the same way someone once opened a door for him, and he didn't need applause for it. In fact, he often told people not to talk about what they were doing to help. Do it because it's right, he'd say, not because you want credit. That's who he was. Quiet in his generosity, loud in his loyalty. Of course, there were still hard days. His body ached more. Long flights exhausted him. There were nights he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about old friends who never made it out. Guilt still whispered in his ear sometimes. Regret still knocked on the door. But he didn't run from it. He let it visit, then let it go. The truth was, Danny Trejo had made peace with his story. All of it. The ugly parts. The painful parts. The miraculous parts. He accepted them the way you accept the scars on your skin. Not pretty, but proof that healing happened. Proof that you lived. He didn't measure his worth by box office numbers or magazine covers. He measured it by the lives he touched. The kid who emailed him saying, "Your story saved me." The mother who hugged him after a speaking event, crying because her son had just checked into rehab. The ex-con who flipped burgers at Trejo's Tacos and said, "I've never felt respected until now." That was his legacy. Danny didn't need a mansion or a sports car to feel successful. His house was simple. His clothes were basic. He still drove the same old truck he'd had for years. What mattered to him wasn't what he had. It was who he was when no one was looking. In the quiet moments, away from the crowds, he often sat outside with his dogs, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sun set over the city that raised him and tried to destroy him. He'd take a deep breath, feel the air in his lungs, and think, "I made it." Not to fame, not to fortune, but to freedom. And that freedom didn't come from beating the system. It came from surrendering to a life of purpose, from choosing humility every single day, from showing up even when it was hard, from staying clean, staying honest, and staying true to the promise he made to himself decades ago. I will never go back. Danny Trejo's story wasn't about being a movie star. It was about being a man who refused to let his past define him. A man who chose light over darkness, even when darkness felt easier. A man who turned his pain into purpose, his mess into a message, his second chance into a life that mattered. In the end, he didn't need Hollywood to remember him, because the people who mattered never forgot. And as long as one person heard his story and believed they could change too, Danny Trejo's legacy would live on, not in lights, but in lives.